This is Voices for Climate, the podcast where activists, scientists, innovators, and everyday people speak out for our planet. If you're looking for honest conversations, bold ideas, and real climate solutions, you're in the right place. My name is Arnav, and today we're joined by Al Grumet. Al is a multimedia artist whose work combines the tools of digital photography with the voice of traditional painting, and part of his work involves using art as an important motivator for climate action. Al, it's an honor to have you here.
Thank you, Arnav. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, so to start off, can you kind of share what first drew you to, art and kind of its intersection with climate activism?
So I've always been connected deeply to nature. I grew up in New York City, but I was in a part of Queens that had a very large park. And I spent a lot of time exploring that park and just trying to experience the trees and the birds and other aspects of nature. And I really became quite connected to the natural world. And both of my parents were school teachers, and they had summers off, so we would travel out west and up north to national parks where my love of the natural world grew. And my initial careers were in the financial services sector. I started as a tax lawyer briefly, and then I was designing financial products at an investment bank, and ultimately wound up working at a hedge fund. And throughout that period, art and in particular photography at the time was kind of an escape for me. And then in 2010, I moved out to the West Coast with my family, and decided that I was ready for a new chapter in my life, and became a full-time artist, and then a few years later, a climate activist. And the way that came about is that I was the associate director of an arts organization called Artworks for Change, and the organization was focused on using art to explore critical social and environmental issues. And so they were doing a lot of content-driven shows, and I wanted to get involved in that, but I didn't have much experience curating. And so I decided to focus on an area on a platform that the organization was less expert at, which was the digital platform. So I built out the website and a series of other digital publishing platforms for the organization, and curated an exhibition that focused on humanity's ecological footprint. And so I did a pretty deep dive into environmental issues through the lens of art as far part of that project. And that kind of set me on my way as an activist.
Yeah, that's a really inspiring story, and I think it's pretty cool to hear, how you went from, first economics and kind of investment banking to now using art as, a tool for climate activism. And was there any specific moment, I guess, that kind of made you realize that this was your, your calling or kind of your new chapter? Or was it kind of just in the moment?
So I did that exhibition with Artworks for Change back in 2015, and I liken it to writing a book. There's a lot of research. I think we had something like 36 artists in the exhibition who were addressing environmental issues and issues of sustainability in a broad range of artistic media. But in the process of researching that exhibition, it was very important to me that I would pair these amazing artworks with uh, useful, important information about the underlying environmental issues. And so I did a tremendous amount of research, and unfortunately, you can't unsee all of that information about environmental stresses that humanity is placing on our planet, and in particular, the climate crisis. And so, once activated, I kept searching for more information about how we could address these challenges. And although I started as an artist with an interest in environmental issues, I pretty quickly, over the course of several years, probably culminating in 2019, my focus really shifted to becoming an activist and figuring out ways that we can put art and every other tool at our disposal in the service of climate activism.
Mhm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I like kind of the way you put it, like you can't unsee what you've already seen, especially when it comes to the climate crisis. It definitely is a very, important issue that I feel a lot of people especially don't realize. But can you, for viewers that are kind of unfamiliar with your work, can you just elaborate more on what your, everyday work looks like in the process of, creating your art?
Yeah, so a lot of it grew out of this activation around climate. And I would say, as someone who's part of my environmental groups, they kind of summed up uh, the years between, say, 2019 and where we are today. They describe my activities as everything, everywhere, all at once. After the movie from 2022, and it's unfortunately an apt description. When I became concerned about climate change, I really dove into a lot of different organizations and spaces. I was focused locally. I was focused on personal action. I was focused on action at the state level here in California, national climate policy, trying to understand climate solutions at scale as well as at the micro level. And when you're immersed in solutions and actual organizations to that degree, you come to appreciate a lot of different facets of the climate movement. And it was through that immersion in the climate movement that I ultimately found a role for art, and in particular my art. And so it was more of an evolution that started with kind of a typical artist's perspective, which is using artwork as an outlet for my own anxieties and fears and grief, um, to then an evolution where you use the art to raise the level of concern among others.
Mhm.
And that's where most artists, their journey in arts and activism kind of ends. And where I became particularly interested, especially in recent years, has been um, focusing on using art and other forms of creative communication and deploying them where the climate movement really needs us. Um,
Mhm.
and I think when you look at awareness of climate change and concern for climate change, we do have a lot of concerned citizens, thankfully. I think the Yale Center for Climate Communications has a number of studies that indicate that 2/3 of people in this country are concerned about climate change, and that's a good thing. So where do we actually need artists and other creative communicators to be working today? Well, it's my view that we need to be working on increasing the literacy around the data, increasing the literacy around the solutions, and then ultimately using art and other forms of creative expression to build political will so that once we identify the solutions that can actually solve this problem, we can make those solutions a reality by building the political will to get laws enacted, both here and internationally. And so as a result of that, my art practice has evolved a lot, right? Because I'm asking different questions of myself and of other artists. And I work with a lot of youth and a lot of other artists to help them find their footing in the climate movement and work on some of these spaces that are a little underserved, namely solutions and building political will. And a lot of um, that vision came from my work with a terrific climate organization called Citizens Climate Lobby, which is focused on training everyday citizens to become citizen lobbyists and advocate for solutions at the scale of the climate problem, and to make those solutions a reality by trying to persuade members of Congress to support specific legislation that moves the needle.
Mhm. Yeah, I love everything you said, especially with the climate literacy stuff you mentioned. I feel like, yes, it's one thing to be concerned, but I feel like if people don't understand or trust the science behind it, it makes it really hard to generate meaningful progress then. And so, can you elaborate more on kind of what specifically your artwork focuses on and what kind of messages or feelings you hope that people take away once they, look at the artwork that you produce?
Yeah, so I would say my art practice consists of really two different types of expression. The first are um, visual artworks that are a little mysterious, but ultimately uh, cause you to want to know more about uh, climate solutions in particular. And then the second space that I'm active in is creating climate themed games. And with the climate themed games, a major emphasis is on using metaphors and creating uh, cognitive dissonance in the viewers and participants so that there's an opportunity to um, you know experience something in a way that creates different types of memories and perhaps more conviction to take action. And so a lot of the embedded narratives in the games, I refer to them as punchlines because that's how I want them to land. So an example of this is a variation on a familiar game, Jenga. Uh, in my version of climate Jenga, it started by looking at that game and saying, well, this is unfortunately a perfect metaphor for where we're headed and how we got there, right? It's an extractive game where you're extracting these blocks, much in the way that we're extracting fossil fuels. And the more we extract, the less stable our system becomes until ultimately the system collapses. But I didn't want the game to be kind of a one direction storyline. I wanted to
Mhm.
modify the traditional game rules so that there would be an alternate path that highlighted the solutions, which include a clean energy transition. And so the way that climate Jenga works is you have a pair of dice that go along with the tower. And when you roll the dice, if you roll an odd number, then you're extracting blocks because that represents fossil fuel use. If you roll the number 7, you have to extract 2 blocks because that represents a climate disaster. And when you have climate disasters, it's tough to focus on solving the climate crisis because you're just trying to get through the week
Yeah.
intact. But if you roll an even number, it represents renewable energy. And rather than taking blocks out of the tower and putting them on top, you go in reverse. You take blocks out of the top of the tower and you reinsert them inside. And what that does is it shows that renewable forms of energy have the effect of stabilizing our system. And the more innovation we get to unlocked by innovation and economic incentives, will then have this virtuous cycle where the more people transition to clean energy, the more that clean energy will be cost effective and efficient, and innovation in transportation and buildings will unlock amazing spaces that haven't been explored. And the quality of life will improve because you will have all of these great technologies, but none of the pollution and none of the side effects associated with traditional forms of energy through fossil fuels. So that's an example of using a game just to highlight the need for a clean energy transition. The central metaphors of the game are very legible, right? You're either extracting and leading to collapse, or you are doing something circular and it's stable and sustainable. And then we weave in conversations about climate policy. What type of policies do we need in order to foster this clean energy transition? And then there's a whole policy agenda we can talk about But the beauty of games and of artwork more generally is that they invite engagement because people
Yeah.
once they experience that metaphor and they're playing the game, they're just very open to understanding, what the underlying dynamic is that the game is demonstrating, and then it's very easy to transition into conversations about solutions.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think, the example of the game you gave was definitely very interesting. I think it's also a good way to get engagement, right? Especially for younger audiences like children. It's a good way to expose them to, climate topics without making it seem super, super daunting. Were there any like memorable interactions you've had with people that have interacted with your artwork in your games?
Um, I think a lot of times there's another game I created that's based on a classic video game called Snake. You may be familiar with the game. It's a snake that operates within the fixed constraints of the game screen, and you go through the game eating apples, and every time you eat an apple, the snake's tail gets longer, and then you need to avoid running into the walls, and you need to avoid running into yourself, and your room to maneuver just shrinks over the course of the game as you're eating more and more apples. Um,
Mhm.
so again, like for me, this was a screaming metaphor for fossil fuel and climate crisis. It's even got the forbidden fruit in there. So for me, it was just a really rich storytelling opportunity. And so again, similar with Climate Jenga, I introduced the alternate path. So we have red apples, and those represent fossil fuels, and when you eat those, and when you eat red apple pies, which are meant to represent products that are manufactured and transported with fossil fuels, so it kind of touches on embodied carbon. The snake's tail gets longer, right? We also created an actual measurement in the game of the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. And so it starts at pre-industrial levels of about 280 parts per million. And then as you're eating these red apples and red apple pies, it starts steadily rising, getting to where we are today, maybe 415. But once you hit 400, all of a sudden these climate disasters start populating the game screen. So again, you have this snake who's got his own problems right now, dealing with floods and wildfires and droughts and a whole host of climate crises. But there's an alternative in the game. You start seeing green apples and green apple pies, and these represent energy sources and the products that are produced from them that are renewable and clean. And when you consume those, the snake's tail does not get longer. And so there's actually a way of playing this game that is sustainable. And one of my favorite moments is sharing this video game because I do a lot of presentations over Zoom, and then watching people's faces as they kind of experience this unfolding dynamic of the red apples, the green apples, learning how to play sustainably, learning how to avoid the appearance of hazards in the begin to begin with, and then periodically these climate solutions will pop up on screen, and just watching them learn through the gameplay has been a really fulfilling experience, and it's just a fun way to talk about difficult issues like climate change and wonky issues like climate policy when you're playing video games or party games or carnival games. These are all really fun settings to have these conversations, and people are curious about the punchlines and the metaphors and the story behind the games and the design. And so they're operating in a different part of their brain than if you're just coming at them with a clipboard and saying, the end of the world is near. You have to sign this petition. It's a different message, and from my perspective, a much easier one to convey.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, especially, what you said about how, art, I feel, based on your explanation, is definitely a unique and, interesting way to, I guess, explain climate concepts in a way that doesn't seem daunting and kind of like, oh, it's, the end of the world, right? So I kind of like the way you put it. Um, how is, your creative process and, the art you've created, like, has it changed in any way as you've started engaging more deeply with climate issues, from the start to, to the present day?
Yeah, so I think in the beginning, I was an artist who was concerned about climate change and using my artwork to express that concern and emote. And at the end of the day, many artists are this way. It's kind of oftentimes an ego-driven endeavor where you are trying to express yourself and looking for validation from others and looking at getting recognition and validation of the work you're
Mhm.
doing. Um, as an activist, it's very different, right? And so now I'm an activist who uses art and games as part of the toolkit, but it's very much art in the service of a set of goals that have very little to do with art and very little to do with ego. It has everything to do with how can we keep the Earth's temperature from rising, beyond 1.5 degrees centigrade, right? And
Mhm.
we're on a trajectory for 3 degrees centigrade. So how do we navigate that space, and how do we use art and games effectively? And once you change the calculus in that way, you view the role of it very different, right? You're not looking to have someone play a game for 4 hours, right? You want them to play the game for 5 minutes, and then you want to spend 4 hours writing a letter to the editor about a carbon pricing bill like that. So
Mhm.
it's a very different set of perspectives on it, and that has been a very dramatic evolution. It wasn't immediate, but it's one that over the past 6 or 7 years has really taken hold for me because again, like you can't unsee what you're seeing. If you're operating in emergency mode, you know, and you have these interests and passions, the more of those interests and passions that you can align with work that the climate movement needs, the more effective you're going to be at having an impact. And what I've been focused on is helping myself and others be really intentional about how they combine things with climate and with the climate movement, and
Mhm.
stripping out some of the ego-driven stuff, some of the we can publish our way out of this problem way of thinking, and getting people focused on, well, what actually is going to solve this problem. We need laws that address climate change at the scale of the problem through price signals, through things that move entire economies. We need solutions that make a clean energy transition happen a lot faster than it's happening now. And
Mhm.
so, those are very specific things, and we need to build political will to make those things happen. And art and games can play a really amazing role in amplifying and mobilizing and activating people. But it's not there just to put on a show.
Mhm. Yeah. And do you see any influences in your work, from your experience in finance and economics? Does that influence your work in any way, or would you say they're kind of separate?
Um, I think in any field, but and finance is no exception. Uh, the people who tend to do well are the ones who uh, develop certain sales skills, right? And you make a decision about how you want to use those sales skills, right? How you want to lead other people. And I made decisions along the way that I wanted to use my creativity and my sales skills to get people excited and hopeful about becoming active in the climate movement. And that was a pivot from how I was using those skills. But without having had those experiences in developing those skills, it would have been harder for me to do the type of work. The other thing that my background in economics impressed upon me is the importance of designing solutions that can operate in a cost-effective way in the real world. And so the policy portfolio uh, that I endorse through organizations and through my own work is very much informed by the economics background. We need
Mhm.
solutions that people can stomach and that will be effective and that will leave enough residual resources for everyone to thrive. And all of that is possible, but not if we are very clunky with the portfolio of solutions that we choose to embrace.
Right. Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense, especially, the part about how these climate solutions should also be feasible, especially economically, right? Because you don't have unlimited resources. And so ensuring that even if we do develop these solutions, that, even after them, still have enough resources to, you know, thrive, kind of as you said. Right. And so I guess, my last question to you then is what role do you think youth can play in the climate movement? And is there any advice you would give to, especially youth who are interested in climate activism and kind of the type of work that you do?
So I think with youth voices have a power to them that I think goes underappreciated by youth. Um, I one of the main pathways that I use for getting youth involved in highly impactful ways in the climate movement is to just get them involved in lobby meetings, right? It's a very direct way of accomplishing a set of goals, right? So if you look at the climate movement, you're going to have people who are engaged in protests or rallies, and they're going to be speaking to the general public often in terms of um, vague I, notions like we need to address climate change, otherwise, our future generations will suffer. Right. So that is an important message. But if you want to accomplish something impactful, there are alternatives to that. You can find people, key decision makers in positions of power, and you can tell them to do something quite specific that is very impactful. And it's a very direct way of advocating for change. And many youth are just don't appreciate that it's so accessible, right? So
Mhm.
I could bring you to Washington, D.C. to have a meeting with a staffer or with your member of Congress where you can ask them to take a specific action. Um, and I've been in meetings with young people and elected officials, and I see how much of an impact that has on the elected official, especially when it's handled with the type of tone that we encourage, where it's very respectful. There's gratitude. There's an understanding of how difficult of a job it is to be a member of Congress, and there's just an honest sharing of goals and shared values, and then connecting that to action on climate change that will make a difference. And I think that's an area where youth can really have a huge impact, and the barriers to getting involved are not significant in the end.
Mhm. Yeah, I 100% agree. And, I think that's such amazing advice and a very powerful note to end on. So, Al, thank you so much, for joining us today and sharing your experiences and insights. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure, and thank you for the work that you're doing. I think podcasts like this, uh, have tremendous reach and provide an opportunity for others to learn about different perspectives of people who are active in the climate movement and get ideas for how they can plug in.
Yeah, thank you. So that's all we have today on Voices for Climate. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to follow the show and share it with someone who cares about building a more sustainable future. And I'll see you all next time. Thank you.